Welcome to the Moneyball Clinic. This might be the single most nerdy video about Football Manager on the internet, as I take a deep dive into all the data available in-game to find those marginal gains that will take Chelsea back to the top of the football pyramid. Today we'll be talking about identifying key metrics within our system and assessing our players against them, possession-adjusted metrics, understanding player value in the wider market, the importance of known commodities, and of course making a whole load of transfers and setting about our Champions League assault. If you haven't seen part 1, don't worry, it's not necessary to follow along, but there is a link appearing in the top right hand corner should you want to check that out first. Let's start by talking about assumptions. This is the tactic we used last season, and the premise was reasonably simple. Maintain enough width to stretch the opposition, move the ball quickly and overload central areas, harass high and early so as to minimise the weakness of our rest defence structure. That's what I assume will happen, but as I used instant result, I cannot know for sure. In fact, even when watching games via highlights, we only see a small proportion of what happens on the pitch, and so data can be very useful for filling in those gaps. This can help identify where some of our assumptions might be wrong, or where players are doing things we didn't expect, both good and bad. I've gone through the data hub, league stats and player performances, but in the interest of time I'll just focus on the main takeaways here. Starting with the XG table. We won the league on merit. We might have scored more and conceded fewer than expected, but we had done enough as it was to deserve to be first. The overperformance just meant we won a little more comfortably. This is important. It validates the system, showing it is successful in its own right rather than down to luck. We led the league by a significant margin in high-intensity sprints, yet completed the 6th fewest dribbles per game. This is what I would expect from a narrow, short-passing, high-tempo system. We also had the lowest opposition passes per defensive action, or OPTA, which is expected given our high pressing approach, as is our relatively poor tackle success rate. You might be surprised to hear that I expect that, but 46% of our defensive actions happened around the halfway line or higher. I mean, have you seen Raheem Sterling tackle? This shows up in free kicks conceded too. We conceded the most, but also gave up the 2nd fewest set-piece crosses. Whilst we fouled a lot, it wasn't in dangerous areas. So those are some of the things that are in line with what I expected from the tactic, stats that confirm my assumptions. But what about the outliers? Firstly, we had considerably more possession than I expected, 58%. In a transitional system, we want to move the ball quickly and take advantage of the opposition defence before they can settle. Thankfully, our increased possession hasn't harmed our chance creation. We averaged 3 more shots per game than the 2nd best team. We also completed nearly 50% more crosses than the 2nd best team. This perhaps shouldn't have been a surprise. By overloading central areas, we are sucking the opposition in and creating space out wide. With players then flooding the box, there are plenty of targets for us to aim for. 1/3 of all our assists came from open play crosses. If we include set pieces in that tally, that goes up to 57%. The final observation is a little more complicated. If we break down defensive actions across the league, what proportion of defensive actions are blocks, clearances, interceptions and tackles, then it splits out something like this. 7% of defensive actions are blocks, 25% are clearances, 33% are interceptions, and 35% are tackles. If we break down our defensive actions, then we perform fewer clearances, but a greater proportion of interceptions and tackles. There wasn't necessarily an expectation here per se, but this helps us understand a little bit more which defensive actions are important to us. With that in mind, we're going to make a couple of tactical tweaks for next season, starting with our left fullback. We know that the narrow formation is helping to create crossing opportunities, and so we're going to encourage our left back to dribble more. We're also going to drop the secondo volante to a support duty, with dribble more and take more risks. I feel that Enzo could be more involved in all phases, not just the final third, and this tweak should help to achieve that. Using what we've learned about the setup and the players, I can now outline what I consider to be the key metrics for each position. I'll start with the out of possession stuff. In the last episode I mentioned two profiles of defensive midfielders, harassers and sweepers. This actually extends to the whole team, and so those who are more involved in the final third I will be assessing based on how frequently they press, and those who sit deeper on how frequently they regain possession. You will notice that I've added an asterisk here. This is because when we look to compare to players in other teams, we'll want to consider possession adjusted metrics. I'll discuss that in more detail later. I want the defensive line to be adept at tackling. The tackle win rate is important here. Whilst our players in central positions have proven to be active in making interceptions, and so that will be considered right through the spine. On to the in possession stuff, and we'll start with movement. There are a handful of roles that are expected to cover a lot of distance, especially those that move positions or make runs from deep. So I want to see average distance per 90 for the inverted wingback, fullback, secondo volante and winger. For the players involved in build-up, I want to see progressive passes and possession lost. They don't need to just aid in ball progression, but do so in a manner that isn't dangerous. For those holding the width, I want to see cross accuracy and dribbles. I don't need to consider expected assists here, because that will come in part from good cross accuracy. For those who will attack the central areas, I want to see excitement factor. So dribbles, expected assists and shots. Then for our strikers, I want to see XG over performance. Finally, our goalkeeper. Possession loss will be important here, as we don't want them giving the ball away, and XG prevented because, well, they're a goalkeeper. With that all done, we can see how our players shaped up, starting with our keepers. Mendy was rather good. He did the sweeping thing, was safe on the ball, and prevented goals. Perfect. Bergstrom was more than adequate cover whilst he was away on AFCON duty. Here are our centre-backs, and there's a few things to point out. Badiashile was superb. He had the best tackle success rate and regained possession a lot. Colwell as his backup was not much of a drop-off. Koulibaly, however, was a disappointment. A 58% tackle win rate is just not good enough. Wesley Fofana was expected to be the starter in the right centre-back slot, but he only played 3 games, so there's no point judging off so few minutes. At right back, Reece James was fantastic, performing well in every metric that matters to us, whilst also proving very creative. Marlo Gusto was a disappointment in relief, specifically in regards to possession won, and we may need to improve this area. At left back, it's a mixed bag. Some encouraging signs in terms of cross accuracy, average distance and tackle win rate, but I would like to see both players carrying the ball more, hence the tactical tweaks mentioned earlier. Martin only played 786 minutes, but there was an argument that he might deserve more opportunities next season. In the defensive midfield strata, there is also room for improvement. Again, I've mentioned some of the changes to the secondo volante role, as I feel that Enzo needs to be a little more involved in deeper areas. Both players lost possession more frequently than I would like for their respective roles. Chalobah gets a mention all to himself. He split game time between centre-back and defensive midfield, meaning it's difficult to compare him to either position. I am happy with his contributions though. We have a similar situation with Mount, who split time between the inverted winger and secondo volante role. His output was immense, with 29 goal contributions. Like Chalobah, I have no concerns here, but it will be difficult to get a true measure of his performance. Mudryk also performed rather well. Fewer goal contributions because he played fewer minutes, but he did the things that we wanted him to do. He scored at the same rate as Mount, 0.5 goals per game, but took nearly 50% fewer shots. That is seriously impressive. On the right, Sterling was fantastic, laying on 18 assists and scoring an additional 7. Pulisic was just a little bit behind him, which is what we expect. We seem well set here. Both players underperformed their XG, but they are not here to be goal scorers. Our strike force is looking incredible. All three outperformed their XG by considerable margins, and all three brought that excitement factor I previously mentioned. Broja is a little bit behind in terms of pressing contribution. We need to talk about Conor Gallagher. He only played 316 minutes. Enzo is very much the centrepiece of their team, and Gallagher was meant to be his backup. But using instant result, the AI preferred to bring on Mount as a substitute for that role, and Conor threw his toys out the pram. We can't judge his performance based on such limited minutes, but it doesn't look like he'll be much of a loss. Before we look at transfer targets though, I should probably explain some concepts that are about to come up.
Here's the Moneyball glossary, it's the Moneyball glossary. Well, technically it isn't a glossary, just concepts poorly explained.
At the heart of anything Moneyball related is the idea of finding players undervalued by the market. But how do we assess value? I put this question out on YouTube and Twitter, and I'd like to highlight some of the answers. Like Tactical Fool, who spoke about determining a cash value based on output. This can be a very useful way of identifying whether we have got a good return on investment. If we can identify ahead of time the expected output, we can work out if a player's demands represent good value or not. If you haven't seen it already, I heartily recommend Tactical Fool's 3 Pillars of Success blog over at View from the Touchline. Link is in the description. Another interesting observation was on understanding need and scarcity. If a player possesses a skill set that is common, his value is going to be diminished, unless they are able to offer something additional to the game. And a club's need is similarly going to impact their assessment. As Silver6428 mentioned, if you have a Declan Rice-sized hole in your system, you're going to be more inclined to spend whatever it takes to fill it, preferably with a Declan Rice-sized player. Now, I don't believe there is a right or wrong answer, and there are plenty of other fascinating responses, but we'd be here all day if I went through them all. The key focus here, however, is that we will need to define value to then be able to determine whether a player is under or overvalued by the market. A key concept, and something that is often used as a criticism of Moneyball, is the importance of known commodities. What a player does is far more important than what we think a player can do. For example, John McGinn has had a very successful career in no small part by utilising his ample backside. I would be a fool to hire him as a twerking instructor. Sure, he might have the tools, but at no point has he demonstrated anything to suggest he can apply them in that manner. This is important in 2 ways. Firstly, the more data we have about a player, the more confident we can be in assessing how they perform. Whilst I'll filter for players who have played over 900 minutes, the equivalent of 10 full games, those who are at the bottom end of that scale will represent significantly more risk. Secondly, we prioritise current ability over potential. And there are 2 different types of potential. The one we are most familiar with, being the scout or coach's assessment of how far a player can grow. Ability to learn is good, and we certainly want to find players who can improve. The second form is talked about less. It's attributes. Attributes tell us a player's capacity, what they might be able to do in the right environment. But these are impacted by morale, consistency, fitness, and even other attributes, and so aren't necessarily an indicator of what a player will do. That's why we key in on performance data. This is the actual evidence of a player's ability. Someone might have the capacity to perform well in our system, but if they aren't showing it, then it's a risk. It's important to recognise that players in different teams and systems have different opportunities to showcase their talent. Per 90 metrics go some way to help standardise performance, but only goes so far. You see, if a player plays for a team that has 60% of the ball, then they're likely to get more opportunities to do things than a player on a team with 40% of the ball. And the inverse is true when it comes to defensive actions. Adjusting for possession allows us to standardise further and help compare players on slightly more even footing. The formula for in-possession actions is as follows: metric divided by team's average possession multiplied by 50. So let's use Koulibaly as an example. He completed 6.05 progressive passes per 90. We averaged 58% possession, so we'll divide by 58, then multiply by 50. So in a system that had only 50% possession, Koulibaly would have completed 5.22 progressive passes per 90. For out of possession metrics, we need to invert the possession number. So if we had 58% possession, that means 42% of the time we weren't in possession. That would make the formula metric divided by team's average possession subtracted from 100, then multiplied by 50. Koulibaly made 1.60 interceptions per 90. We'll divide this by 100 minus 58, which is 42, then multiply by 50. So in a system that had only 50% possession, Koulibaly would have made 1.90 interceptions per 90. Some metrics aren't impacted by possession at all, those measured as a percentage, for example. With that in mind, let's look at the squad planner. Based on what we discussed earlier, I expect we'll be moving on Gallagher, Koulibaly and Cucurella. I think I will also look to send Bergstrom, Gusto and Datro Fofana on loan to get them more consistent game time. There's a couple of things I want to add in here. Mount is also the backup at Segundo Volante. Andre Santos is probably ahead of Chukwuemeka and Casadei for the third choice. Pulisic is the third choice inverted winger, and Armando Broja would be the backup for both striker slots. Chalobah is cover at right back and centre back. Colwell can play at left back. With that all considered, the squad planner now looks a little like this. I want a new left back, someone who will elevate our game from that position. I want a right-sided centre-back, and an improvement on Koulibaly is a must. They will be expected to compete with Fofana for the starting job. I want a striker who will potentially push Gyökeres down the pecking order. Those are the starting calibre players. We also need backups. A backup keeper, preferably experienced, who can allow our youngsters to go out on loan. A backup to Reece James in the inverted wing-back role, so Chalobah is only needed there in an emergency. A third-choice defensive midfielder, and a third-choice winger. So let's create some filters, using the minimum minutes requirement mentioned earlier, focusing just on the leagues we have loaded, and using the metrics we identified for each position. It is worth mentioning, limitations in the filters means that we can't key in on the exact thresholds for metrics, instead having to focus on the closest value below. For example, Koulibaly won possession 11.19 times, so we'll look for players above 11 for that metric. Taking a look at centre-backs who are interested in a transfer, our options appear limited. Whilst we feel we can improve on Koulibaly, that doesn't mean he was bad at everything. It is possible that a player could be worse than Koulibaly at one thing, but considerably better at everything else. So let's move these thresholds a little. That's better. I've gone through these options before recording this, so I'll just show my preferred choices. Fikayo Tomori is the standout here. He slightly underperforms Koulibaly in progressive passes, but excels everywhere else. Moreover, he is homegrown at Chelsea and his wage demands seem reasonable. At left back, the options are once again limited, even when we expand the criteria. This isn't unexpected. Cucurella is a good player, and when looking for marginal gains, there are only going to be a small handful of options. Digne is a good option though. He would bring some much needed experience to an otherwise young back line, and outperforms Cucurella in all the key metrics. Let's assume we can only sell Cucurella at the bottom end of its valuation, and have to pay the top end for Digne. That would still see us with a net £12 million profit. Digne's wage demands, however, would be approximately 40k per week higher, or £2 million per season. Over the course of 4 years, that would amount to roughly £8 million. We'd still be making a profit, albeit only about £4 million. Up front, we have plenty of options, with the marquee choice being Rafael Leao. He's a winger who played on the wing, so we have to be mindful of how this impacts his performance, but he has displayed that he is able to do the things we are looking for. It would be a club record fee, and his wage demands are high. Not a surprise given his reputation, but we do have to question whether they are reasonable. More on this a little later. Gabigol's demands are far more palatable, and he would be willing to come in as a squad player, meaning a more open competition with Gyökeres. His phenomenal output in both expected assists and XG over performance are very encouraging. He would be my preferred option here. Or at least he would be. This would be how I'd approach it if I was keeping everything within FM itself. Now, at the end of the last episode, I said there would be no spreadsheet shenanigans. I lied. As alluded to earlier, there is a significant limitation to comparing players in FM, which is the inability to adjust for possession. To do this, especially on a large scale, I need to use external tools. Using the same criteria of minutes and leagues, I've exported a view with all the metrics I consider key. I then manually input the average possession for every team. Et voila. Here I've recreated those search filters, so we can look for players who outperform our incumbent players based on possession adjusted metrics. We can even move those thresholds here as a percentage. So using Koulibaly, instead of looking for players who are better at everything, we can look for players who are within 90% or better at everything, or 75%, and so on. Finally, there's a secondary search, looking for players who are better at all but 1 or 2 criteria. For Koulibaly, once again, we've set this to 4 out of 5 criteria that need to be met. For a role like the Segunde Volante that has more criteria, we are looking for 6 out of 8. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed there was a column at the end labelled score. This is entirely arbitrary. Using a player's average rating, I've applied a weighting based on the strength of the league. This league strength is based on globalfootballrankings.com. It allows me to get a loose understanding of how a player's performance might be viewed in a wider context. Let's be clear, average rating is not perfect. It has its biases, but it's a mechanic that the game uses, and so it will always have value. More importantly, it gives us an assessment beyond the scope of our own tactical preferences. Let's take Enzo Fernandez for example. There is an argument that he is the best player in the world for what we want him to do. There's certainly not a single player who outperforms him in every metric, and those that do in the partial search are considerably worse when it comes to progressive passes and ball safety. That doesn't make him the best midfielder in the world, and so this ranking just gives us a vague idea of where he might stand. And this will be useful for assessing a player's wage demands. Let's order these tables by wage rather than weighted score. Enzo, who was rated as the 7th best midfielder, is currently the 15th highest earner for that position. If he demands a new contract, we can see that a wage around £275,000 per week might be reasonable. Again, I must stress I use this as a loose guide. If he were to demand a little bit more, say 300 or 325k per week, this wouldn't be egregious. Let's apply this to an actual situation. Edouard Mendy is about to enter the last year of his contract, and his performance has definitely been good enough to justify an extension. At 32, he's entering his prime and should be able to perform at a high level for many years to come. There's a few players who outperform him in everything but possession lost, but no one who jumps out to me. He ranked 3rd amongst keepers, but I don't think he quite merits to be recognised at that level just yet. That would come with wages of around 250k per week. His demands are around the 140 to 170 mark. The top end would put him 7th, the bottom 11th. After negotiations, he was willing to accept £140,000 per week, which is definitely palatable. So what are the next steps? First, I'm going to create a long list with most of the players from the search tabs. I say most because for some positions there are a lot of options, so I won't be adding them all. In total, I've added 275 players. We will eventually scout them all, including players I would consider unrealistic. Players such as Kylian Mbappe, who have zero intention of signing for us, or whose wages are so high already that it is almost impossible for them to ever represent good value. I include them because we don't know what might happen over the summer. If someone ends up surprisingly transfer listed and the package makes sense, we want to be in a position to react. From this list, I have created a short list. 3 players who seem most interesting to me for each position that we are currently looking to strengthen. These will be the priority for scouting. It's possible that we sign none of these players as issues will be revealed or I don't think it represents value, but it's a starting point. So let's skip ahead to the start of the season, where all will be revealed. Let's start with the departures. As expected, we found new homes for Cucurella, Conor Gallagher and Kalidou Koulibaly. A combined 123.5 million. Saudi teams were once again our saviour, although Koulibaly was signed by Real Madrid, which I must admit surprised me. A further 30 million was raised from the sale of Ethan Ampadu, and that might be the most egregious Saudi overspend of the save so far. We also managed to loan out the young players we identified earlier for a little under £13 million. Let's welcome the new arrivals. We'll keep this light for the players signed as backups. Isaiah Jones was the Championship Player of the Year, scoring 13 times and laying on a further 11. He underperformed Raheem Sterling in every metric, but what would you expect from a player coming in to be 3rd choice? He's happy to be a fringe player and arrives for £8.5 million. Maximo Peroni won the battle to be our 3rd choice defensive midfielder. 70% better at winning back possession than Ullman and considerably better at retaining it too. This came at the expense of progression. A modest fee of just over £6 million was required to pry him away from Man City. Devyne Rensch measured better than Reece James in possession metrics and was also more successful in the tackle. He was less progressive and covered less distance. All of this was in part because he spent time at centre-back. He arrives for £17 million. I'm going to break down the starter options a little more, starting at left-back. 3 candidates, all beginning with J. The Janus brothers. JJ Top. The BJs. Maybe not. Let's cast Gallon aside for the moment and focus on Jesus Vazquez and Josh Doig. Both very affordable options. Both ranked lower than Cucurella, but outperformed him in every key metric. Both are comparable in tackle win rate and cross completion. Josh Doig wins out, however, in all of the other metrics. Covers 8% more ground, attempts 11% more pressures, and completes 56% more dribbles. In a head-to-head, there's a clear winner. Bringing Gallon back, we've got a few things to consider. Gallon actually only beats Cucurella on 4 criteria. Performing fewer attempted pressures than his Spanish compatriot, but had a significantly higher weighted ranking. 5th across all fullbacks, in fact. When compared to Josh Doig, he covers less distance and completes fewer dribbles, but is a more accurate crosser and wins a higher proportion of tackles. Both players have desirable personalities. Both have similar goal contributions, and both are incredibly interested in joining. One, however, costs 4 times more than the other. So we're going to sign Josh Doig, right? Wrong. Doig's love of long shots and passes is not particularly congruent with our playstyle, and as mentioned a long while back in the video, our defensive unit could do with some experience. Gallan is a better fit for what we want to do. We part ways with £42 million and £150,000 per week. Next up, centre-back. Our options are the previously mentioned Fikayo Tomori, Leipzig's Willi Orban, and Flamengo's Fabrizio Bruno. All three fall short of Koulibaly's 5.22 progressive passes per 90, but are within 10%. All three are considerably better than Koulibaly's pitiful 58% tackle success rate. Fabrizio Bruno is immediately discounted. He started as the least likely option, as the other two outperform him in every metric, and his poor adaptability is the final nail in the coffin. Willi Orban has the highest weighted ranking, and his wage demands, though higher, are more in line with his expected value. Tomori performs better at regaining and retaining possession, and has the added benefit of being homegrown, but his wage demands are higher relative to his performance. We can do better. Enter Loic Bardet, Rennes' best defender last season, who is transfer listed as they no longer require his services. He actually outperformed Koulibaly in every metric, just not as impressively as the previous candidates at regaining and retaining the ball. Not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, we've signed him for £10.5 million and £58,000 per week. Up front, I narrowed it down to Gabigol, Samu Omaridian, and Serhou Guirassy. Gabigol was discounted because of his adaptability, but I'm going to engage in some revisionism and claim it's because I suspected him of doping. Omaridian had a breakout season, scoring only 14 goals but outperforming his XG by nearly 50%. His pressures were on the low side, but otherwise he outperformed Simeone in interceptions, dribbles and shots. He's not a flashy name, but he might be the perfect fit. Or at least he would be if it wasn't for his traits. Plays with back to goal is not what I want for my attackers, and whilst he's young and can be coached out of it, I'm looking for players who are ready to contribute now. And so that brings me to a familiar face. Serhou Guirassy was the striker we passed on last summer. Back then he would have cost us about £37 million. He'll cost us a further £25 million now. That's what 32 goal contributions will do for a player's value. Like Omaridian, he underperformed Simeone in pressures, but performed better in all other key metrics. It's an easy decision, right? Well, imagine if we sign him and he outperforms Gyökeres. Isn't that just evidence that I got it wrong? Can my ego handle that? I suppose we're about to find out. 62 million, 150k per week. That's a total spend of £146 million, 99 million more than we spent the previous season. We might have still turned a profit, but the pressure is now on to deliver. Let's skip forward and see how we got on. It's official. I don't know what I'm doing. Serhou Guirassy was a revelation. He finished as our top scorer with 32 goals. That's 1.09 per 90. Simeone added 24 more, Gyökeres 18 before a broken leg entered his season, and Broja a further 13. That's 87 goals between them. That fired us to our second successive league title. We scored 3 goals more than last season and conceded 2 fewer, as we improved from 86 to 95 points. It was, once again, deserved, although our XG overperformance was not as impressive as last time out. How did our other signings get on? Maximo Perrone played 15 minutes, which is a good thing. He was signed to be the third choice defensive midfielder. Him playing so few minutes meant we didn't need to use our third choice defensive midfielder. Similarly, Isaiah Jones only played 300 minutes. He was rather good in those 300 minutes, it must be said, and if I was to carry on this save, I'd consider moving on Pulisic and bumping Jones up the pecking order. Devyne Rensch played a respectable 1700 minutes, and our gamble on his average rating being maintained in the Premier League failed. Or did it? We had 5 key metrics for the inverted wingback: possession won, tackle win rate, progressive passes, possession lost, and distance covered. He outperformed Reece James in 3 of those metrics. That doesn't change the fact that we overpaid in wages, but there are some encouraging signs. Loic Bade did not beat out Fofana for the starting job, but still played over 2,000 minutes. There are some concerns, most notably his poor possession won stats. His 68% tackle win rate was a massive improvement on Koulibaly's, and even over Fofana, but this could still do with being higher. Interestingly, however, he had the highest win rate in the team, and this wasn't because he was playing against bad opposition. Finally, Javi Galan was incredible. 25 assists in all competitions. He was a marked improvement over Cucurella in every way conceivable. To be fair, we needed him to be good. He played 4,305 minutes as Martin was plagued by injuries throughout the season. Injuries were a pretty big theme, in fact, especially from March onwards. Gyökeresz's broken leg was the catalyst for a series of injuries up front that at times left us playing Raheem Sterling and youth player Mason Burson as strikers. We were unable to field a full substitute list in any of our Champions League knockout ties, and there were a few. We overcame a 2-1 away defeat against Newcastle to reach the quarter-finals, where we overcame a 2-0 away defeat against Barcelona to reach the semis. We overcame a 3-2 away defeat against Liverpool to reach the... Oh, that was as far as we got. Our Champions League campaign ended at semi-finals, but we had a chance to get our revenge against the Scousers in the FA Cup final, which we also lost. Fofana and Mendy were injured in the run-up, seeing us give a debut to 24-year-old backup keeper Jamie Cumming, but that wasn't why we lost. We created enough to win, despite Enzo picking up a red card, but our shooting boots deserted us. An anticlimactic end to an otherwise very fun journey. 2 leagues, 1 cup. Without doubt a great outcome and a far cry from how things are going in real life, but I can't help but feel like we could have done just a little bit better. Until next time.